and welcome to another edition of Trim Talk TV. Today we've got Mathieu Roche in the studio/office. Mathieu, thank you.
Hello, Kieran. Thanks for having me.
And Mathieu is now the CEO of ID5, and he's here today to talk about cookie matching. Before we jump into that cookie matching sort of overview, let's just talk briefly about ID5.
Sure.
And tell us what it is and what problems you're solving.
Yeah, so ID5 is a very new company that I created last year, and it's a centralized cookie matching platform. So we're centralizing cookie syncing, and we're creating cookie syncing as a service for the ad tech industry and publishers.
And we'll go into a bit more at the end. But first of all, Mathieu, we want to talk about cookie matching, which is obviously an intrinsic part of programmatic and the industry at large. But not a lot of people know about it, and it's sort of like it's very operations focused, but it sort of is the bedrock for a lot of programmatic activity globally. So let's just talk about that. I want you to sort of jump into it and explain a little bit more about the process of cookie matching.
Sure. It is indeed plumbing, but it is critical plumbing for programmatic. So let's try to illustrate this by looking at a publisher who has ad space to monetize and is going to use an SSP or maybe more SSP into a header to monetize its inventory, and who also has audience data, user profile, and who's probably going to use a DMP to monetize that. Okay, and those two platforms are going to monetize inventory and audiences via DSP, who are going to be the tool that the buyer uses to acquire this. Okay. The way the industry works on the web is that all platforms operate for a different domain, okay? Meaning that they know users with different names. They all speak different languages, okay? So the DMP might know the user as being ABC, the SSP will know the user as being XYZ, and the DSP 123. They all have different domain, different cookies, and different ways to name users, okay? This part of the transaction in programmatic happens server-side. Bid requests, segment transfer, that all happens server-side, meaning that the DSP, to understand that this is user 123, SSP needs to send the bid request with the buyer ID in it. DMPs need to send audience segment with the buyer ID in it. So they need to rely on what we call matching tables.
Yeah.
Simple databases that says that XYZ for me is actually 123 for my DSP friend. Same thing here. ABC for me is 123 for the DSP. So that when there is a bid request to be sent to the DSP, they can say, actually, the user that I'm going to call you for is not XYZ, it's 123, so that you can bid on it. If you don't have that information, DSPs don't bid. Plain and simple. And if you don't have that information, they cannot read profile data from the DMP. So matching tables are critical for that server-side part of the transaction to operate. Okay? So how do we create matching tables? That's where cookie matching comes into play. So basically, to be able to create this, they call each other. How do you know this user? Yes, I know that user, and it's called 123. Do you know this user? Yes, I know this user is called 123. And they store that information here. Okay? But there's not just one DSP in the market.
Yeah, there's plenty. 30,
and there's plenty of SSPs and DMPs as well, right? So you've got a number of platforms that you have to match users with, right? And so the way the ecosystem works, every time a user comes on a page, those platforms are going to synchronize ID with the entire ecosystem, with each other. Yeah, you start to see the problem,
it's a
right?
bit of a mess.
Yeah, and that's why you've got 20, 50, 100 pixels being called on every page, as Ghostery would show you very well. It's for this process to happen. It's for platforms to be able to synchronize with each other so that they've got matching tables so that then they can monetize publishers, audiences, and inventory through programmatic pipes. Okay? So it looks messy. It is a mess. And the first issue that we have is page latency.
Yeah. So if you have like 60 pixels there on the page loads are affected, user experience is affected. And,
exactly.
And most people would decide to leave the site after 20 seconds of page load.
Exactly. So we routinely see pages with like 60, 90, 100, 150 pixels being called in the background that can slow down the page, even if they load, in the background. If they load asynchronously, it slows down the page, makes the page really, really slow, takes a lot of bandwidth. That's the number one problem. Number two problem is leakage.
You mean data leakage? Yeah.
Data leakage, exactly. Because the way this works, the publisher has a contract with the DMP and the SSP, right? They probably know some of the guys in here, but maybe they don't know all of them, and maybe they don't trust some of them. But right now, they don't have a choice. These guys will still be executed on their pages, and God knows what they're going to do with the data, right? So there's a risk here of leakage because people are being called on that page without having necessarily a relationship with the publisher. Okay, so that's the number two. Number three is match rates. This is not scalable. The more platforms you have, the more complicated it gets. And it's exponential, right? If you've got 10 platforms to synchronize with each other, that's 10 times 10's connection. If you've got 1,000, that's 1,000,000 connections.
And
it's just not sustainable.
And sort of like on a financial side, I mean, the more match rates you have, the more money a publisher earns. So what's the typical match rate?
Like I said earlier.
What's the typical match rate now in this?
Like I said earlier, if the SSP cannot pass the buyer ID to the DSP is not going to bid. Mm-hmm. That impression is lost for the publisher. If the DMP only has 50% or 60% match rate on a segment, only 50 or 60% of its data is available to buy. So they're losing a potential 40% of their revenue. Okay, so there's a massive impact of match rates on the money that gets back to the publisher in the end. And even if it's just 5% of impressions, or even if it's just 10 or 20% of your audiences that is not matched correctly, 5% of impression, the difference between an inventory that has more than one buyer ID in the bid request and none is probably 1 to 3. So you triple the revenue that you make if you've got the right bid density, the right level of buyer IDs, the right number of buyer IDs in your bid request. Right? So if you can triple your revenue on even 5% of your impression, I think that's pretty significant. So this is really important. And it's only going down because the more platforms you have, you don't have more room to synchronize. So the more platforms you have, the more choices you have to make, and the lower your match rates between platforms. And last, the elephant in the room.
Oh.
A little thing called GDPR.
It's not really an elephant, it's more like a herd of elephants.
The publisher is the data controller in this process, meaning that they are responsible towards the user to tell them who are the platforms, what data they're collecting, for what purpose, and who they're sharing that data with, right? Cookie syncing is considered personal data collection because it's user IDs, okay? So it's the publisher's responsibility to communicate the list of platforms that are being called on their pages. And right now they don't know, so they can't. So compliance with GDPR, the transparency element of GDPR is really tricky for publishers with this system in place.
Okay. So how do you solve that? The GDPR thing is quite big. How do you solve the problem now? It's moving backwards through the 4 points. How do you solve the problem with the GDPR stuff first?
Well, basically the problem comes from the fact that we all speak different languages, right? So there are two ways to solve this. Either we all speak the same language, and that's the position that some ID consortium have taken, saying, hey, let's still use the same ID so that we don't have to translate anymore. So that's one way. The other way is to say, well, let's have better translation dictionaries, and let's just improve the quality of our translations. Right? So that's what we're doing with ID5.
Right.
We're creating a centralized matching table that everybody can tap into to access everybody else's ID. Okay? So like a multilingual translation framework, right? By doing this, well, you're solving latency because all of a sudden you don't have, n square
hops,
connections to make. You just have n connections to make to that central mapping table that will tell you that ABC is XYZ, is 1, 2, 3, is etc. etc. Right? You've got the central repository. You don't need as many connections to get to access those matches. Because by centralizing this, we're also making it accessible to the publishers. So the publishers can decide who is authorized to synchronize on their pages. Maybe they don't want to work with this SSP, or they don't know this SSP, or they don't have any business with him. They can decide not to synchronize with this SSP, or for this SSP not to be synchronized on their pages. So by doing so, we're solving the leakage problem. No unauthorized, no unknown entity can synchronize on your pages. So no more leakage anymore. And we're also solving for the transparency issue, because all of a sudden it's not an unknown list of platforms that are being called by other platforms and other platforms. It's people that you control. It's platforms that you control, that you've decided. So you've got a list. You literally have a list of platforms that are authorized to execute synchronization pixels on your pages. So you've got that transparency element covered as well. And last, the match rate. By centralizing and by optimizing syncing in the middle, you can improve the match rate that everybody gets, because you've got more opportunities to see users and to match them than each individual part of that network would have on its own. So by implementing this centralized syncing matching infrastructure, you can solve a lot of the problems that are limiting cookie syncing right now, and that are limiting the efficiency of programmatic for publishers and platforms, without having to replace everything with a new system.
And then in the DSPs themselves, will there be people behind it using different cookies themselves? So like around that nexus, would there be a Media IQ cookie, or will they have a different sequence of matching? Like, so how, like, the problem could be exponential, like, rather than just having one DSP, there could be many people, many seats. Is that the same situation? Or
so different seats will probably be using the same. I mean, most of those platforms operate on a single third-party domain.
Right.
But you've got some first-party platforms, especially DMPs, right? So you will have some first-party DMPs who will have an advertiser-specific domain. Mm-hmm. So syncing from those platforms is a challenge, because you can only operate
with GDPR, there's more likely more first-party DMPs come, already.
Maybe. And again, the more you have, the more complicated this gets. So the more we need something to simplify the way the ecosystem works. And first-party DMPs are a really good example. They have a very small scale to work from, basically just the domain of their client. And so for them, getting to a good enough match rate is a real issue. So being able to tap into this master matching table that aggregates everybody's reach to kind of get to high enough match rates is really critical.
So what you obviously just kicked this off. You're going now at 6 months. Is that right?
Yeah, 6 months.
In terms of like the match rates you've seen since implementation, what kind of growth are we talking about? Like in terms of like from
it all depends from where you start, but we've doubled match rates for some of our DMP clients. So we're working from a small base of syncing. We've enabled a DSP to buy 15% more inventory thanks to better matching. So again, it depends from when you start. If you start from 80% match rate, we're not going to double it. But we can improve it, marginally.
Yeah.
If you start from 50%, it can be any percentage points of match rate improvement means more revenue for the publisher and more revenue for the platforms that operate on behalf of the publisher in the end. Yes.
Okay.
It's just, this system needs to be more efficient if we want, as an industry, to be competitive against the walled gardens, who don't need to translate because they've got their own language and they can speak it from the beginning to the end, right? For the rest of the industry, premium publishers, independent ad tech platforms, we need translation capabilities for the system to work. So the better we can make this translation mechanism work, the better it is for the independent.
Is your core customers then publishers themselves plus the platforms? Is that who you're talking directly?
Publishers and platforms, yes, absolutely.
Right.
Any platforms that operates in programmatic needs to match cookies with its partners, and so they can either use us or instead of or on top of their existing syncing infrastructure.
And do you think that your particularly publishers, are they aware of the problem? I mean, I'm sure the ad ops people who are very much in the weeds on this stuff and very, very knowledgeable, but are publishers generally knowledgeable that this is such a critical issue for them?
I think GDPR is kind of an eye opener for a lot of publishers because they
have to realize who their clients are, who the platforms are, because obviously with the consent process, I don't even know who's on my platform. I'll give you a good example. we use a sharing tool that's run by a large marketing tech platform. And if you look at the ghostery on our page, they're shooting off all these different vendors. And I said, I've never actually, like, we know who we are, we put Facebook and all the rest of it. They're all like our plugins for sharing, but there's all these 20 different vendors. I'm going, where did this come from?
Absolutely. This is exactly the complexity that we have here. And this isn't necessarily bad for you, because it might be people who are going to end up buying your inventory.
Well, we don't sell any inventory, that's the thing. Like,
okay, so then that's another question. But I'm not saying that cookie syncing is necessarily bad the way it's working right now for publishers. I'm just saying it could be improved, it could be more transparent. Publishers could have more control over this.
And can a publisher use your platform?
Absolutely.
To manage the vendors in the system?
Exactly.
Okay, that's pretty interesting, because that's actually got a good way to manage the process, particularly with GDPR.
Exactly. One of the problems of cookie syncing right now is that it's not transparent.
Right.
And it's not controllable by publishers. And GDPR is putting a big emphasis on transparency and control. So making cookie syncing more transparent and more controllable for publishers is really what we're looking at.
Okay. Matthew, thanks for that deep dive. I mean, it's a fascinating space and obviously needs to be cleared up. And given that GDPR is coming next month, I think this is going to be a bigger issue. So look forward to your growth in Europe.
Thank you very much, Kieran.
And thanks for coming in today, Matthew.
Thank you.
And that was Trader Talk TV, and we'll see you next time.